Hey guys, how's it going? Today I want to talk about something that I call the wolf projects. The wolf is in reference to the character from Pulp Fiction who comes in and cleans up a big problem. And he's called the wolf. Actually, I don't know why they call him the wolf, but his role is to clean up problems that other people are struggling to solve. About half of my projects, in my experience, have been what are called the wolf projects or reclamation projects. The code base has grown beyond maintainability. The current team is in over their head. They've either been fired or you're coming on board to either replace them or to help them, one or the other. And your job is to take the code base and refactor it, make it better. Sometimes you start over. Um, and that's about half my project volume in my career. However, lately that's been more than half. In the past 12 months, I've done five considerable contracts, more than just like $1,000. We'll say at least $10,000. So we'll call that a bona fide contract. And of those five, three have been wolf projects, reclamation projects, where I'm coming in and the code base is such a monstrosity that my job is really not to move the project forward. It's just to get it back to a point where it even works, just get it back on track. And in all three of those cases, a rewrite was probably the best move, but they almost never go for a rewrite. I don't think I've ever been in a situation where I was able to convince the founders to go for an entire rewrite when in these situations. So you're walking into sort of a fire. Imagine a house on fire, and your job is to put out the fires like one room at a time. Whereas oftentimes the answer is let the whole thing burn down and start a whole new house, right? But typically the reasoning goes that the founders are like, we already spent all this time and money, we can't just junk all that. They don't know that that's really the right move anyway. So these are our wolf projects. In the past year, I've had a higher percentage of those than I would normally expect. A lot of that is systemic to the industry at large and what's going on in tech trends in general. These wolf projects that I've had in the past 12 months are React Redux reclamations. So what's been happening is, at least in startup world, and so you're not going to see this in like Airbnb. I know they technically a startup, but we're talking like early stage startups, less than 10 to 5 people on the team, that kind of thing, small groups. And if you go back to one of my other videos where I explain, how to interview with these kinds of startups, you'll see how these situations come up in the first place. So what tends to happen is a startup will hire a couple of junior devs, anywhere between 1 and 3, maybe 4, to build out the MVP. Since they're looking for a budget solution, they're going to hire people who are either just out of college, just out of a boot camp, have less than 2 years of experience, and their experience might not even be completely applicable to what they want to build in a React Redux environment. So a situation might be Joe Schmo graduated at XYZ Bootcamp where they taught Ruby on Rails and maybe MeanStack, right, Angular 1. But he needs to get into React and Redux. So he's able to convince a startup that has a small budget, under $50,000, to hire him, Joe Schmo, to build the MVP. And then, but he's going to use React and Redux, never having used it before, at least in a professional context, to build it out. And to the startup, this looks like an appealing proposition. We get a modern stack at a budget solution. To Joe Schmo, he's excited to learn React Redux. He's been wanting to because he understands that this is a good career move. And before long, they get started. And before they know it, the project has grown beyond their capacity to maintain it. Joe Schmo is not qualified to take on a project of this scope, at least by himself, and build it out to a scalable solution for XYZ startup. This may sound overly hypothetical or theoretical. It is not. I see this happen over and over and over again. It's a very common situation. It's why people like me have no trouble finding work. like I said, at least half my volume is these situations where eventually, after about somewhere usually between 3 and 6 months, the founding team, the entrepreneur realizes that they made a mistake and that they either need to bring on more support for Joe Schmo or they need to replace him altogether. Either way, they realize that it's time for a switch. And these are wolf projects. You want to be the Harvey Keitel guy coming in and cleaning everything up and getting everything back into working order and riding the ship back into working order. So now that I've explained what that is, I want to go into some of the more nuances of the problems I see in these technical stacks, obviously without naming names, but I'm going to point out a few technical issues that I've seen sort of again and again across a couple of these projects that a lot of sort of more beginner React Redux developers are not handling well, and that's why they need to hire more senior level skill. So one thing I've seen a couple times is people not really understanding the one-way data flow nature of React, typically because they're coming from an MVC style architecture like Angular 1, very typical MVC. Ruby on Rails, heavily MVC focused, where you have different units of code, basically triangular units, model, view, controller, operating sort of independently of one another to create a larger scale application. That's MVC architecture. So all those sort of groups of code, these MVC units are basically their own operating centers, and there's no sort of central location of data, which would be the store in a Redux environment. So oftentimes what happens is a coder will, using React Redux, but not understanding the React Redux paradigm, will set up multiple components and maintain its own data inside the component state and not really using the store as much as you should be using the store, as much as he should be using the store. So you might have 3 container components all maintaining their own local state, processing application-wide data locally in their local component state. And some of that data will cross over, should be shared across components, which is essentially the whole purpose of Redux. That's why the whole one-way data flow exists, such that the programmer, the developer, will try and write all these crazy scripts and methods to sync up all the data across multiple components. And sometimes I've seen it happen where they write actions for that and route those actions through the store, which literally defeats the purpose of the store. That's just not using Redux the way it was designed. It's basically forcing in an MVC style architecture into the Redux environment. And I've seen that a couple times now because, like I said, these are people coming from an MVC style background. So again, it's almost always Angular or Ruby on Rails, trying to shove in a React Redux, shove the MVC style into a React Redux environment. I'm very aware that this is what's happening because I used to do stupid stuff like that when I was first teaching myself React Redux. The difference is I didn't charge anyone for it. I was just teaching myself. And it took me a couple of those sort of beginner projects, messing it up a few times before I realized, oh, all of this should be in the Redux store. That was sort of my clicking moment, my aha moment, like, oh, that's why the store exists. So we can centralize all this data inside the store so that the components don't have to worry about it. They can just react to the changes to the store, right? It took me about 4, 5, 6 weeks to sort of really understand that, right? So, I'm seeing a lot of those mistakes happen in a Wolf project, a reclamation project. And so when you go into a code base of that sort and you see that going on, that's one thing you might encounter in these situations. Or more realistically, if you're watching this video, it's one thing that you should make sure you don't do. It's a very more common mistake. I understand that most of you guys are 1 to 2 years of professional experience, so realistically you're not going to be the wolf in this scenario. So I guess the best way to take this information is to make sure you don't make these mistakes, which I've seen over and over again, or at least at least recently I've seen this enough times. So that's one example, sort of a common mistake I've seen in a reclamation project where you have to come in and clean up all this work. That being said, I remember one example about a year and a half ago. A friend of mine who's a senior dev, Ruby on Rails, he didn't know any React Redux, but his job for his company was to hire React Redux developers, and he hired 2 from General Assembly in New York City. Probably shouldn't have mentioned the name, but I really don't care at this point. And they were just fresh graduates of General Assembly. At that time, they were not teaching full stack React Redux. I think they're definitely still doing Rails, and I'm not sure what they were doing on the front end. It might have been just jQuery, the web immersive. And so the one person he hired, one of the 2, she was trying to learn React Redux, and she was asking my friend, who's also by coincidence is named Dan, how to organize the state and the components in the state in the Redux store and whatnot. And she wasn't asking him, she was telling him that she's going to do it this way. She's going to maintain all the data in the separate components for now until they need to change it. And Dan, the other Dan, my friend Dan, was not really aware of understanding the implications of this architectural decision. So he was asking my advice, saying, is this a good idea? Do you think she's making the right move? To which I said very clearly and unequivocally, no, she's not making the right move, because you damn well know that the data is going to increase and the complexity is going to increase very rapidly within a couple months, at which point they're going to have to go back and rewrite all that logic inside the Redux store and the reducer. So you may as well just do that now to create a foundation for a growing code base if you know it's going to grow. So he relayed that back to her, to which she said, I understand where he's coming from, but I'm going to just do this for now until we cross that bridge. And my friend Dan was like, well, he's just going to have to go along with it, because he couldn't argue his position. He's not a React Redux developer. Long story short, we all know what happens. The whole code, this is a very common scenario. The reason I'm pointing this out is don't be that person. Don't be obstinate. Because if, as a beginner, as a junior person, this girl just graduated a boot camp, okay? So she doesn't give orders, she takes orders, right? Her job should be to get better, not make architectural decisions. So really, the onus is on the other Dan, to be completely honest, to say, no. My friend, who's a React Redux professional developer, says this is the way to go. Plus, he was very clear on it. There was no ambiguity. He said, this is the right decision. So you are going to do the following. Now, it's on him for not doing that. So I don't criticize her too much. But the junior dev, the GA graduate. But my point is this. If you're a junior dev in that same position, you have to resist the impulse to fall into your comfort zone. Okay? The comfort zone there is the MVC style architecture, because that's what you just spent the past 3, 6, 12 months learning, right? And so you think that by imposing that style into this environment, you'll be able to progress faster. And in the short term, you're correct, by the way. It is a short-term decision at the expense of long-term benefit. That is like the literal definition of technical debt. Right? Short-term compromises at the expense of long-term stability. And that's what this person did. It's a very junior move. So if I were in my friend's position, I would have done one of 2 things. As a senior dev, as a CTO of the company, I would say, this is the decision we've made. This is what you're going to execute. This is not up for discussion. That's number 1. Number 2, we're going to have to let you go, because you're going to hurt the team, and that's it. And realistically, when I'm meeting with other developers and whatnot, I can sort of gauge that mentality before it even gets to my desk. Like I make sure those people aren't even part of my team. So it's more a matter of reading that personality style before you even make that hiring decision. So again, long story short, that eventuality is exactly what happened. About a few months later, Dan was like, yeah, you were right. I made him promise to me that after the end of the first conversation, I made him promise to me that when it eventually comes to pass that I'm correct, All I want you to say to me is, you were right. That's it. Just walk up to me and say, Quan, you were right. I should have listened to you. That's all I want. I don't want money. I don't want a consulting fee. I don't want any of that stuff. Just when I see you in the elevator, say, Quan, you were right. I was wrong. I should have listened to you. It's pretty much all I wanted in that case. Dan and I are good friends, so I'm not being a dick about it. It's just I want them to know. I want people to acknowledge when they're right and wrong. I have to acknowledge I'm wrong all the time. It's something you have to do when you're wrong. That's basically it. Anyway, that's number one. Another thing that I've seen, not a lot. I'm just sort of going through stuff I've seen recently in sort of terrible code bases in a React Redux environment. Another type of reclamation project I've seen is a code base will have started in Angular 1 because the founder, generally these are non-technical founders, so they're hiring a guy who just graduated a boot camp, a college or university, self-study, and they don't know the difference between Angular 1, Angular 2, React Redux. To them, it's all brand new technology. So they'll find a guy who's doing Angular 1 at like 30, 40 bucks an hour in New York City, which is like basically free in New York City, not knowing that you're already putting yourself 10 yards back of the starting line by starting a code base in Angular 1. So they'll do that for a few months. And then they'll hear, they'll go to meetups, conferences, demos over and over and start hearing React Redux, React Redux. I should be doing React Redux. They'll talk to a few more sophisticated people, technical people. After a few months of that, they'll get it in their head that, shit, we should have been doing React Redux the whole time, right? Because it's going to be harder and harder to hire for Angular 1 as time goes on. So a very typical Wolf project here is converting an Angular 1 code base into React Redux. And that's what I did about 9-10 months ago, around last Thanksgiving time. That was when that contract started. That was literally an Angular 1 to React Redux assignment. That problem was littered. That assignment was littered with problems. Their React Redux code base was not properly set up at all. They basically set up from a React Redux standpoint. What this team of developers did, who, by the way, they had never done React Redux before, so they were trying to get started, because they didn't quite understand container presentation view, that whole distinction very well. As they understood it, every component in a React Redux project consists of two subcomponents, one container version and one presentation version. So you might have a component called submit button component. Then in this particular code base, there was another component called submit button container. And it was literally a one-to-one match throughout the entire code base. So if you had, let's say, 75 components, which is a typical size, that's not that unusual, then in this particular code base, there would be at least 150 components, a container version and a presentation version. I'd never seen that before, and I'd never seen that since. It was just a very confusing way to organize your components, and it also created a whole another layer of just abstraction that wasn't necessary, and as well as all the corresponding levels of errors and edge cases, things that can go wrong. So I made that clear to my client, saying this organizational structure is highly unconventional. I don't quite understand why they did this the way they did. It was a very sticky situation because those developers were still there, and this is also an interesting dynamic that you may come across if you start doing freelance work like I do. A lot of developers are very insecure, and they think by bringing on new talent, their job is being threatened. So oftentimes, they interpret sort of my criticism or my feedback, or my analysis is a better way to put it, as me gunning after their job. But to be honest, I couldn't give a shit about that job because I'm going to get some other contract in a couple of weeks. I'm going to move on to the next thing. This company that I'm looking at is already a sinking ship. I've already made that determination pretty much before I even came on board. At this point, I'm just billing hours because this is easy money. And I know that this startup is going nowhere. And they'll probably run out of runway in about 6 to 12 months. And then the whole thing will collapse. And then that's it. All right, and I move on to the next one. And that sounds very depressing, and it kind of is, but that's been my professional life for about 5 years, almost 6 years now. Every startup, most of them just go nowhere. And the thing is, I can see that happening before I even get started on the work. It only takes me about 2 meetings, and definitely once you look at the code base, you can just see it all right there. Like, oh, these guys are going nowhere. Not because the code base is so shitty, but because the decision-making process is so flawed that is symptomatic of a bigger problem. And when the decision-making is that fundamentally flawed, even on the code level, that is symptomatic of an overall problem in the leadership. So I already know this is going nowhere, but they still have 60,000 runway. I'm going to take about half of that, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing. So the thing is, though, if the previous developer is still there, they think that you're going after their job. And again, I just couldn't give a shit. I'm telling them, even though I may have a cynical view on the situation, I still conduct myself with integrity. I'm still doing my job. I'm still fulfilling my mandate, which is to explain to my client what the problems are, what it'll take to fix it, how long it should probably take, and how much money it's going to cost. And then the client can make a decision. I still execute my role to the best of my ability, because why not? It's all the same to me. I'm not here to steal money, but I'm going to take it if I'm paid to do it, and then I'm going to move on to the next thing, right? That's the wolf, essentially. He comes in, does his shit, gets out of there, and on to the next thing, right? So the dynamic there could be a little bit sticky if the previous developer is still on the team, because then you got to talk to that guy every day, on Slack and whatnot. Oh, speaking of Slack, very good thing is that you want to have as many of these conversations on Slack as you possibly can, because that puts everything on right. That's de facto documentation. So if at any point if your client says, or more accurately, if another developer on the team says, well, so-and-so, well, Quan said don't do it this way, you have a whole conversation on Slack that you can point to and said, nope, December 7th, 4:55 p.m., Tuesday, right there, I said do that. And then there's just, that neutralizes all arguments. So thank God for Slack as far as that goes, because before the Slack days, these conversations were much stickier. People would just have revisionist history. I don't know if they just made things up, but what I tend to find is that people don't remember things the way they happened. They remember things the way they wanted it to happen. Over time, that becomes their actual memory. Right? They remember things the way they wanted it to happen, not the way they actually happened. So if you're having too many conversations with no recording of any kind, either audio or actually just on Slack, then that could be pretty dicey. So you want to have as much of this conversation on Slack as you possibly can. Very important to recognize, so that whenever someone says something that doesn't sound right, or maybe you're the one misremembering things, just go back and look it up on Slack first and make sure you have all your memory straight. Okay. So that was one thing. So this contract and this team in particular, their Angular 1 code was for the most part pretty solid. That's probably why they wanted to do Angular 1, right? Because that's their comfort level. They're in their comfort zone, right? But going from there to React Redux, I've done Angular 1 professionally as well, so I understand that transition is not comfortable at all. But that's also why I didn't charge anyone for it. I taught myself for several months, right? That's a business ethics thing. I wouldn't charge anyone for my personal education unless the client actually said, I would like to pay you to learn, which would be pretty sweet. But that's not what happens. That's not why I get my business, right? So the Angular 1 code was pretty solid, thankfully, which made going through the Angular code pretty manageable. But then transitioning that over to React was completely stalling the project. for the previous team. So I worked on that project for about 3 or 4 months, give or take. After which um, I would go through a series of suggestions, like you should rewrite this module or rewrite that module, rewrite the entire code base, quite frankly. After enough of no, we decided to go this way instead. I left the assignment. When your suggestions, if you're confident in them, are repeatedly rebuffed, or let me rephrase that, when my suggestions are repeatedly rebuffed, the one decisions that I know are the right decision, after a few times of that, I just say, all right, well, you clearly don't want my advice because you've turned it down many times, so I'm just going to leave. And that's what happened. Um, I've since heard they've burned through all their runway and they don't exist as a company anymore. So, or the project is dead. The company, the entity still exists, but the project is dead. What was I going to say? So that's how I make the decision. Well, so to give you one example, another example of sort of what you should watch out for. So in a particular case, we're looking to install a calendar module into a React component, right? And I looked at a few React modules specifically for calendar UI, right? Like a Google Calendar type of thing, where you can click on a date and add a appointment, that kind of thing, a calendar interface for React. And there were a couple out there, and I had to cross-reference all my decisions with the senior dev, the CTO, who was the Angular 1 guy. And so I said, why don't we try a couple of these, all on Slack. And he wrote back saying, well, I'd rather try a few jQuery calendars first, because jQuery is more conventional. Everyone knows jQuery, and it'll be easier for me to wrap my head around that rather than learning all this React stuff, so I can mess with the calendar too. This is a bad decision. To which I said, well, these are React optimized components for a calendar UI. We may or may not even use jQuery on certain pages. jQuery might not be part of this in the future. So by maintaining everything completely in a React component environment, that decision won't bite us in the future, won't bite us in the ass down the road. And as far as my client was concerned, the original CTO, the main leader, the CTO, the Angular 1 guy, he had final say on those decisions. So I'm now being forced to make a decision that I know already is anti-best practice on account of either incompetence or stubbornness or whatever you want to call it, right? So that's why I generally just walk away after a while, because after enough of those decisions, you're essentially being coerced into making anti-best practice decisions, right? And that's another sort of case that I came up against, where people were trying to shove in non-React sort of tools and pieces into a React architecture, not understanding the implications of such. That's a very beginner move. That's something I see a lot in a beginner sort of code base. So if you're walking into a Wolf project, that's something you should look out for. So and so is using these modules, that are not necessarily React compliant. You certainly can install a jQuery calendar into a React component, but then you're adding dependencies, specifically jQuery, and maybe that the particular library you're using is dependent on a certain version of jQuery. Maybe it's jQuery, it's like 1.7 or whatever, and for whatever reason it was never upgraded to 2 or 3 or whatever it is now, right? So that means you have to find a specific version of jQuery to install. And that also happened in this same project. This particular dev team was installing modules that were tied to certain versions that have since been deprecated. And so you couldn't just upgrade it. Normally that's what you would do, but the problem is they version controlled these libraries. It's a long story, but the short version is that you shouldn't version control your dependencies. Like the NPM modules, you're not supposed to version control those. You're supposed to install them on each individual code base. that's more of a just a general rookie move. I'm not really sure why. That's not a React thing. It's just sort of a general like amateur move. So these are things I've seen in Wolf projects recently. Another one. Um, Over the summer, I had another. This was the worst, by the way. This one that I'm about to describe to you is a Wolf project that was built on Meteor, which is a fine platform for sort of a back end as a service. But um, once again, this dev team just didn't really understand. They were using this as an opportunity to learn Meteor and then try to learn that with React. So now they're learning Meteor and React. And so the mistakes were the code base was just crapping out everywhere. Um, and that was a complete fiasco. Um, their Meteor setup, and I'm not a Meteor expert myself, so you know, to 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 comment on the Meteor setup would not be best for me to do. But the React setup was it had implications on the React setup. So it followed closely again to an MVC style architecture where you had all these Meteor client library connections inside individual components, and individual components would process the data from the Meteor side, the Meteor server, inside each component separately. In other words, bypassing the Redux store. Now, I brought that up to my client, and one of the other lead devs was like, yeah, this is how Meteor suggests we do it. So maybe that is Meteor best practice, but it's not overall best practice, right? So, and again, always the client here is non-technical, so he's not really sure who knows what they're talking about, and he's torn between whose advice he should take, and to him, he's just hearing two different opinions, both of which are completely nonsensical to him, right? And so, again, I'm always the one, my arguments are always the one defeated in these because I'm not a long-term stable solution. I'm not a co-founder, I'm not the CTO, I'm not even a full-time employee. I might be doing 20 hours a week. And frankly, I'm not emotionally checked into this project. I don't really care if they fail. I care about two things. Do the checks clear, and did I do my job? That's all I care about. And those are basically the only two things I can control, right? So if I do my job, those checks are going to clear, and that's it, right? So I was doing my job. I told my client, and I said, this is what's going on. Here's what you need to fix. They also had a couple other problems, like there were had all these upload file scripts on different components, but some components would send the upload to the actual server itself, the Meteor server, so they would get stored on either Meteor or some like EC2 instance or whatever, and then some other ones would send the files to an S3 bucket, which is the more appropriate way. That's more best practice, but different components would send the files to different destinations, right? And so that was a very odd decision, like same file types, like PDF documents, JPEGs, images, things like that. So that was a very odd and certainly non-best practice decision. So this is another thing you want to make sure you don't do. It may seem kind of silly, like who the hell would do that? Well, we're talking, this is a startup that raised about $2 million. They, at the time that I joined, they had spent like 600,000 on development across like several different platforms. So it's not like, we're not talking about like a high school project here. Like this is a big assignment, and the team that I was walking into probably had about 7 or 8 devs, give or take. So it sounds like I'm describing like a sort of like a college project, group project, where half the group is checked out and one kid's doing all the work. That's not what's going on here. These are ostensibly professionals, right? People who have been doing this for many years, but certainly not React Redux for many years. So part of what I did was also the S3 bucket was not parked behind a CDN, so there was no like CloudFront and Cloudflare. So one thing I did was I shoved that thing behind a CDN right away. And it only took me like a half hour, so I didn't even tell my client I was doing that. I was just like, look, I just have to take care of this right away because this is just embarrassing. Like I'm not going to put my name on this. So that project was pretty much dead on arrival. I only spent about a month on that before I realized there's less than no hope on this, so I walked away from that one as well. Reclamation projects are, by far the worst things to work on. It's also it's also the most eye-opening in terms of how things are run in startup world. And I guess the best takeaway for you in this video is, here are some of the mistakes I've seen. Please don't be that guy. If you can avoid these mistakes, at least you'll probably make other mistakes, but at least you won't make these, the ones that I'm telling you right now. So that's another one. Let's see, what else? What other project did I do in the past year or so? So yeah, I had another one back in March. Uh, this guy actually did go along with the full rewrite. I think partly because he's technical. This guy was a data science engineer, and but he wasn't a web engineer. So even though he's very smart and very technical, he didn't know React versus Angular and didn't understand those dynamics. He's more of a data science guy, so he knows like all the data science stuff, NumPy, Pandas, Jupyter, whatever. And so his startup, he hired one Angular dev, exactly the scenario I described. New York City, 40 bucks an hour, just out of a boot camp, didn't know React Redux, so he built out the code base in Angular 1. Old school Angular 1, just at this point almost dinosaur technology. And we're talking March of this year, like 6 months ago, like not that long ago. And this guy, another WeWork friend, he asked, he knew I was an expert React Redux developer, and he asked me to take a look at, or not, I'm sorry, not React Redux, an expert web developer, and he asked me to take a look at it from an Angular 1 perspective, or just the code base, I'm sorry, and I did, and the first thing I said, well, I mean, it's good enough code from an Angular 1 standpoint, but it's Angular 1, like you're going to want to raise money. You're going to want to hire more developers. You're going to need to, you want to expand your code base. Your code base right now is off to a bad start. It's off to a bad start because you're setting yourself up for non-long-term stability. You're basically guaranteeing a rewrite at some point. And this guy actually, just because he's technical, he understands these implications. He understood this very well. Was like, all right, then let's just tear the whole thing out, start over. Just if that's what we gotta do, that's what we gotta do. That's what we did, and that only took about a month anyway. That was quick. When the decision making is right, things are smooth, and things will get done. The problem is the decision making oftentimes, more often than not, is poor, and that causes a lot of it throws a lot of road blockages, right? A lot of gums up the works. You're throwing sand in the engine, like it slows things down, right? And the problem is the central decision maker, the founder, he's basically flying blind. He doesn't know who to listen to. It's all just beyond his comprehension. And so he's just operating off gut instinct, who he feels is the more authoritative person. Who does he trust more? And that is the worst thing he can do as a non-technical founder. And this goes on over and over and over again. It'll never stop. It's why guys like me can make a whole living off this, and why I can charge what I charge, because after you've been burned for 6 months and $40,000, if you have another $40,000 left in your runway, you are not going to fuck that up. This time you're going to get it right. And then you hire generally, one thing I left out of all these stories is a lot of these other developers are non-American. They're overseas teams. I'm not going to name the countries, but you can probably figure them out. So this time, when the startup founder tries again, this time he thinks, all right, I'm going to get it right this time. I'm going to hire an American. He's going to be local, as local as possible, even New York City if I have to, and get that part of this right, right? A lot of startup founders just don't survive that process. They only have $40,000. They only have $30,000, and they burn through all their runway, and that's game over. Thanks for playing. Your money's gone, and whoever took it, he's off to the next thing. Right? It's tough. It's tough. It's a tough. The market is tough. Right? The market does not have any emotions. It doesn't care about you. Right? Too many startup founders get emotional, and they think like, well, I'm working so hard, my idea is so good. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. That's not really the main point of this video, but it's something that I've come across a lot. Um, it Rather than get upset over it, get annoyed by it, you want to use it to your advantage. Like I said in one of my other videos, a lot of these startup founders are overly emotional. They're too impressed with themselves. You want to play into that emotion and make them feel like you really want to be part of that team, and you bring expert technical skill, and that just adds to the startup's founder's own personal vanity. Like, oh, I'm hiring a guy who could work at Google if he wanted to, right? And it makes him feel like his startup is that much more prestigious. That's how these situations even happen. That's how these things even happen in the first place. So really, rather than getting like annoyed over it, you use it to your advantage. That's what I do. I've got it down to science now. It works pretty well. Um, but the things that you want to avoid in terms of messing up an initial code base from a React Redux standpoint are what I just described. Um, those are the things I've seen so far that that don't surprise me. I'll probably see again and again in a shitty React Redux code base. Um, once you get the whole React Redux paradigm sort of worked out, do a couple of your own projects, get the whole like concept and the data flow figured out, it's really not that hard. So what you want to do, I mean, coming from, a guy who's been doing it for a while now, so maybe I should speak for myself, but at this point for me, it's not that hard. So what you want to do is to just bang out a bunch of your own projects, make all the mistakes on your projects, get all that shit sort of worked out, and then hopefully you become the wolf. You want to be that Harvey Keitel. You don't want to be the guy. You don't want to be the guy behind him. You want to be Keitel. You want to be the guy who's in there fixing problems, right? Because once you're that guy, all you need is about a month of being that guy. And then if you want it to be, you become the boss. If you want, you become the boss. I don't mean literally, the founder's always the boss, but to a certain extent, you can even boss him around, say, no, this is the tech decision we're making. Don't even question me on this. This is how it's going to go, right? To be clear, every startup assignment that I just described in the past 12 months that I just described to you, they all wanted me to stay full-time. They all were offering at least 150K, none of which is high enough for me, by the way. They were all offering stock options, and they were all like, please, we want you to stay full-time. We want you to become CTO. We want you to be our full-time, our go-to, our consigliere on this tech stack. Why not ever go for that? Because a lot of these startups are dead on arrival. They won't last for many more months. The decision making is too poor, and the founders' priorities are just not in the right spot. Like, why are they renting, 3,000 square foot office in Midtown Manhattan or Soho? Like, why are you doing that, you retard? Like, you shouldn't be doing that. You should be saving all that money and working out of your apartment. But that's a whole nother video I'll get to later. But that's why I don't go for these jobs, because it's just going to be another 6-12 months anyway, and then basically the company will go under and I'm on to the next thing. And so it's just a contract anyway. But my point is, if you become that guy, you're the de facto boss, if you want it to be. It depends on how assertive you are with that role. Me, personally, I'm not very assertive with that role because I don't care about these companies emotionally speaking. There's no investment for me emotionally or financially. I'm hammering my checks and I'm moving on to the next thing. That being said, I want to be very clear. I still fulfill my professional obligation, my responsibility consummately. I don't shirk my responsibilities, but as far as like me wanting to actually stay on the team long term, no, no. There's going to be another startup down the road and just more and more contracts. That won't ever end for me unless I want it to. I'll decide when that ends. So, the point is, you can be that guy if you want to within a startup. If you can really parlay that situation into your own full-time role, but you have to clearly demonstrate your value by being the cleanup guy, the wolf, right? And so that'll be very hard to pull off, within just 2 years of experience. You'd have to be sort of exceptionally gifted to pull it off, with less than 2 years of experience. But you can always do things to increase your skill set. And for now, that should be just banging out as many React Redux projects of your own as you can. Rather than just keep on saying that, I'll just get you started. What you want to do is just go to, I'm not marketing my tutorials, all this is free anyway, but just go through all the React Redux projects. These are free. Just go through these, right? And maybe even the React Native one, the simple Snapchat one. Go through this one. Everything I'm pointing out is free. These are all the free ones. And just go through those a million times. Go through those until you can just do them in your sleep. If you're watching any of my demos in person, my live demos, so this right here is a live demo, this one right here. Okay, if you watch this live demo, when you get through that, you will realize Quan is improvising. He's just making this up as he goes. How do you know? Because I make mistakes in that demo that I fix on the spot. Not only that, I also think out loud and I say, oh shoot, I didn't really consider what's going to happen here. Let's fix that. Right, that happened a couple times in that demo. You need to get to that point where you're just freestyling this code out of your fingers. You're just freestyling it out, and that's it. Once you get to that point, you can become the cleanup guy, the wolf, the solution. All right, you become that guy. Most developers I work with are not there, at least not in React Redux. Probably other stuff like Ruby on Rails or Angular 1 or whatever, but not React Redux. So you get to that point, then you can become the wolf in the project, and then you basically maintain that position for a month, maybe 2 months, and then when you do that, you then call the shots. You can stay, you can dial up your hours, you can work from home, do whatever you want. You dial back your hours. You can say this week I'm going to do 20 hours, next week I'm going to do 40, and the client will just take as much as you want to give because he's desperate. He's desperate. And then you just, I mean, don't take advantage of that, but the point is you control the shots, right? Again, I want to be clear, I don't take advantage of people. I just maximize my own leverage. That's what I do. I maximize my leverage. And then from there, I decide what I want to do with it. And typically what that decision is, I'm not sure how much longer I want to stay because I don't think this startup is going to last much longer. And almost always I'm correct. Almost always I'm correct. So, even if I had taken those full-time offers, well, that lasts another 6-9 months. And then, boop, startup's under, got to go back on looking for contract work anyway. And that's it. So it's all sort of, 6 of one, half dozen the other. It's all the same, right? So, okay, well, that's pretty much it. If I think of any other sort of common scenarios I see that you want to make sure you avoid, I might do a follow-up video. Actually, shit, I just thought of one right now, but I don't want to spend another 15 minutes on it, so I'll do another follow-up video later. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any questions. As usual, this is my website. I do have a Slack channel. If you want to get on my Slack channel, just shoot me an email, and I'll send you an invite, and or just put it on my YouTube. Well, I don't know if you don't want to put your email in my YouTube. Whatever, we'll figure it out. This isn't too complicated. So, all right. Hope you enjoyed it. Catch you in the next video.